The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Emma pulled her car into the gravel lot beside the Pineview Ranger Station. The windshield wipers groaned against the glass, leaving streaks that made the world outside look like a watercolor painting left in the rain. She killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the steady percussion on the roof above her head. The ranger station was a modest log building with green trim, its windows glowing warmly in the gray afternoon light. A wooden sign by the door read Cascadia National Forest, Visitor Information, in carved letters that had been painted white years ago and were now chipped and faded. Emma grabbed her jacket from the passenger seat and made a run for the covered porch. Inside, the station smelled like coffee and wood polish. A middle-aged man with graying hair and a thick beard looked up from behind a desk, cluttered with maps and pamphlets. His uniform shirt bore a patch with the Forest Service logo, and his name tag read Ranger Mills. "Afternoon," he said, setting down his coffee mug. "Wet one out there today. Tell me about it," Emma replied, shaking the rain from her jacket. "I'm looking for information about the Whispering Pine Trail. I heard it's good for overnight camping." Mill's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing his features. "Whispering Pine, you said? That's up in the northwest section, about 12 miles from here." He paused, studying her face. "You planning to go alone?" "Yes, I'm doing a solo hiking trip. I've been planning this for months." The ranger was quiet for a long moment, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a topographic map. He spread it across the desk, pointing to a winding blue line that snaked through contour lines, indicating steep terrain. "This is the trail," he said. "It's about 8 miles to the designated camping area. Good water source, level ground for a tent. But I have to ask, you're experienced, right? This isn't exactly beginner territory." Emma nodded. "I've been backpacking for 15 years. I know what I'm doing." Mills seemed to weigh something in his mind. Finally, he pulled out a camping permit and began filling it out. "Trail conditions are good, despite the rain. Should clear up by evening. The thing is," he paused again, pen hovering over the form, "we've had some unusual reports from that area recently." "What kind of reports?" "Probably nothing. Campers sometimes get spooked in the woods. You know, their imagination runs wild." He looked directly at her. "But there have been complaints about strange sounds at night. People saying they heard breathing that didn't belong to any animal they recognized." Emma felt a small chill, but she forced a smile. "I'm not easily frightened, Ranger Mills. Besides, it's probably just deer or elk." "Probably," he agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He finished the permit and handed it to her along with the map. "Just be aware of your surroundings, okay? And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, don't hesitate to pack up and hike out, even in the dark." The rain had indeed stopped by the time Emma reached the trailhead, though the forest still dripped steadily around her. The parking area was empty, except for her small sedan, which wasn't surprising given the weather and the late hour. According to her map, she had about 3 hours of hiking ahead of her, which would put her at the camping area just before dark. The trail began as a well-maintained dirt path that wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves, and every surface glistened with moisture. Emma's boots squelched softly in the mud as she found her rhythm, her backpack settling comfortably on her shoulders. For the first hour, the hiking was easy and pleasant. She passed a small waterfall that tumbled over moss-covered rocks, and spotted a family of deer watching her from between the trees. The only sounds were her own footsteps, the drip of water from the canopy above, and the distant call of a woodpecker somewhere in the forest. As the trail began to climb more steeply, the character of the woods changed. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out more of the sky. The undergrowth became denser, creating dark pockets where the afternoon light couldn't penetrate. Emma found herself checking her watch more frequently, aware that the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. She was about halfway to her destination when she first heard it. At first she thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but as she stopped to adjust her pack straps, she realized the sound was different. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but too deep and too slow to be human. She stood perfectly still, listening, but the sound faded away. Emma shook her head and continued hiking. Mills had mentioned that other campers had reported strange sounds, and now she was primed to hear them too. It was just the power of suggestion, nothing more. But 20 minutes later, she heard it again. This time she was certain. It was definitely breathing, coming from somewhere off to her left in the dense underbrush. She stopped and called out, "Hello, is someone there?" Silence. Emma waited for several minutes, but the breathing didn't resume. She convinced herself it had been a large animal, maybe a bear or elk, that had moved away when it detected her presence. She continued up the trail, but found herself glancing frequently over her shoulder. The sun was touching the treetops when she finally reached the designated camping area. It was a small clearing beside a creek, with a fire ring made of blackened stones and a wooden food storage box mounted high on a post. The spot was sheltered by enormous cedar trees whose trunks were easily 6 feet in diameter. Emma quickly set up her tent on a level patch of ground and gathered wood for a fire. The temperature was dropping with the sun, and she wanted to get a good blaze going before full darkness settled over the forest. As she worked, she found herself listening carefully to the sounds around her, but heard nothing unusual, just the normal evening chorus of insects and the gentle babble of the creek. She had just gotten her fire started when she heard voices coming up the trail. "I'm telling you, this is the right way," a man's voice said. "The map shows the camping area is just ahead. We should have turned around an hour ago," a woman replied, sounding tired and irritated. "It's getting dark, and I don't like being out here after sunset." Emma stood up as 2 figures emerged from the trees. The man was in his 30s, tall and lanky with sandy hair and an expensive-looking backpack. The woman was younger, perhaps mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a worried expression. "Oh, thank God," the woman said when she saw Emma's campsite. "We're not lost after all." "I told you we were on the right track," the man said with a grin. He extended his hand to Emma. "I'm Rick, and this is my girlfriend Amy. Sorry to intrude on your solitude, but would you mind if we set up camp here too? This is the only designated site for miles." Emma nodded, though she felt a pang of disappointment. She had been looking forward to a night alone in the wilderness. "No problem. There's plenty of room." Rick and Amy quickly set up their tent on the opposite side of the clearing. Amy remained quiet and seemed nervous, frequently glancing toward the dark trees that surrounded them. Rick, on the other hand, was talkative and energetic, chattering about their hiking plans and asking Emma questions about her experience in the area. "Have you been up here before?" he asked, as they all sat around the fire after dinner. "First time," Emma replied. The ranger at the station mentioned some unusual wildlife activity. "Have you noticed anything strange?" Amy looked up sharply. "Strange how?" Emma hesitated, not wanting to alarm them unnecessarily. "Oh, just some reports of unusual sounds at night. Probably nothing to worry about." But Amy was already shaking her head. "I knew we shouldn't have come up here. I've had a bad feeling about this place all day." "Come on, Amy," Rick said, reaching over to squeeze her shoulder. "It's just the woods. There's nothing out here that can hurt us." "Then what was that sound we heard on the trail?" Amy shot back. "That wasn't any animal I've ever heard before." Emma felt her stomach tighten. "You heard something too?" Rick waved dismissively. "It was probably just a bear or something. They make all kinds of noises." "It didn't sound like a bear," Amy said quietly. It sounded like a breathing, really deep, slow breathing, like something huge was sleeping just off the trail. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, watching the flames dance in the fire ring. Around them the forest had grown completely dark, and the trees seemed to press in closer to their small circle of light. "Well," Rick said finally, forcing a laugh, "if there is something out there, the fire will keep it away. Animals are afraid of fire." They talked for another hour, but the conversation felt forced and artificial. Amy kept looking over her shoulder into the darkness, and even Rick seemed less confident than he had earlier. Emma found herself straining to hear beyond the crackle of burning wood, but the forest was unusually quiet. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier as the night wore on. Finally, Rick yawned and stood up. "I think I'm ready to call it a night. We want to get an early start tomorrow." Amy was already heading toward their tent. "Good night, Emma. Thanks for sharing the campsite." Emma banked the fire and crawled into her own tent, but sleep was elusive. Every small sound, the settling of her tent fabric, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind in the trees, made her tense with alertness. She found herself holding her breath, listening for something she couldn't identify. It was sometime after midnight when the breathing began. At first it was so quiet that Emma wasn't sure she was really hearing it. She lay perfectly still in her sleeping bag, straining her ears. There it was again, a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from just outside the clearing. It was slow and measured, like the breathing of something enormous in deep sleep. Emma's heart began to race. She wanted to convince herself it was just the wind, but the night was perfectly still. There was no natural explanation for the sound she was hearing. The breathing continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. Emma waited in tense silence, but it didn't resume. Finally she began to relax, telling herself that her imagination was running away with her. Then she heard Amy whisper from the other tent, "Rick, are you awake?" "Yeah," came the quiet reply. "I hear it too." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. If all three of them were hearing the same thing, then it wasn't her imagination. The breathing started again, but this time it was closer, much closer. It sounded like it was just at the edge of their campsite, somewhere in the darkness beyond the dying embers of their fire. "What should we do?" Amy's voice was barely audible. "Just stay quiet," Rick whispered back. "It'll go away." But the breathing didn't go away. Instead it began to move. Emma could hear it circling their campsite slowly, the deep inhalations and exhalations coming from different directions, as whatever was making the sound moved through the trees around them. Emma's mouth went dry. She reached carefully for her flashlight, but hesitated to turn it on. Some instinct told her that drawing attention to herself would be a very bad idea. The breathing stopped again, but this time the silence was even more terrifying. Emma realized she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Minutes passed like hours, as they all waited to see what would happen next. Then Amy screamed. The sound was muffled, as if she had clamped her hand over her mouth, but it was clearly a scream of pure terror. Emma heard frantic whispering from their tent, and then Rick's voice, louder and more panicked than before. "Oh God! Oh God! Do you see it?" Emma couldn't help herself. She grabbed her flashlight and unzipped her tent flap just far enough to peer out. Her beam swept across the campsite and froze on Rick and Amy's tent. Something was pressed against the side of their tent from the outside. Emma could see the clear outline of what looked like a massive hand, but wrong somehow, with fingers that were too long and joints that bent in places where joints shouldn't be. The thing was perfectly still, as if it were listening to the terrified whispers coming from inside the tent. Emma's beam wavered as her hand shook. The thing outside Rick and Amy's tent slowly turned toward her light. She caught a glimpse of what might have been a face, pale and elongated, with features that were almost human but stretched and distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Where its eyes should have been, there were only deep dark hollows that seemed to absorb her flashlight beam. Then it was gone. Emma blinked, and the shape simply wasn't there anymore. Her light played over empty air where, just seconds before, something impossible had been standing. "Did you see it?" Rick called out, his voice cracking with fear. "Emma, did you see it?" I don't know what I saw," Emma replied. Though she was lying, she knew exactly what she had seen, even if her mind refused to accept it. "We have to get out of here," Amy said, and Emma could hear her moving around inside their tent, probably packing their gear. "Right now, I don't care if it's dark." "She's right," Rick said. "This is insane. We're leaving." Emma heard them breaking down their campsite with frantic speed. Part of her wanted to join them, to pack up and flee into the night. But another part, the part that had brought her into the wilderness alone in the first place, rebelled against the idea of running from something she didn't understand. "You should come with us," Rick called out, as they shouldered their packs. "Whatever that thing was, it's not natural." Emma emerged from her tent and stood by the dying fire. "I'm staying," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I came here to spend the night in the woods, and that's what I'm going to do." Amy stared at her, as if she were insane. "You can't be serious. That thing could have killed us." "But it didn't," Emma pointed out. "It just watched us. Maybe it was more afraid of us than we were of." Rick shook his head. "I'm not taking any chances." "Amy, let's go." They headed for the trail, their flashlight beams bobbing through the darkness. Emma watched until the lights disappeared completely, then turned back to her campsite. The clearing felt much larger with just her tent in it, and much more vulnerable. Emma rebuilt the fire, piling on enough wood to keep it burning brightly for hours. Then she sat on a log beside the flames and waited. The forest around her was completely silent now, as if every living creature had fled the area. Even the creek seemed to babble more quietly than before. Emma found the silence almost as unnerving as the breathing had been. Hours passed. Emma dozed fitfully by the fire, starting awake every time a log shifted or sparked. Each time she opened her eyes, she half expected to see something standing at the edge of the firelight. But the clearing remained empty. It was just before dawn when she heard the breathing again. This time, it was different. Closer, yes, but also sadder somehow. The deep rhythmic inhalations and exhalations seemed to carry a weight of loneliness that made Emma's chest ache with unexpected sympathy. She stood up slowly and peered into the darkness beyond her fire. "I know you're there," she said quietly. "I can hear you." The breathing stopped. "I'm not going to hurt you," Emma continued, feeling slightly ridiculous, but somehow compelled to speak. "And I'm not running away. If you want to watch me, that's okay. I just want to understand what you are." Silence stretched between them, and Emma thought she had made a mistake. Then, quietly, that she almost missed it, she heard something that made her blood freeze. It sounded like crying, not the crying of an animal, but the deep heartbroken sobs of something capable of genuine grief. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the trees and filling the clearing with its anguish. Emma felt tears spring to her own eyes, though she didn't understand why. Crying continued for several minutes, then gradually faded away. When it stopped, the normal sounds of the forest began to return. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an early rising bird. Emma sat by her fire until the sun came up, but she heard nothing more. As the first rays of light filtered through the canopy, she began to pack her gear. Whatever had visited their campsite was gone now. She was certain of that. The presence that had watched them in the darkness had departed with the night. The hike out was uneventful. Emma reached her car just as the ranger station was opening, and found Mills already at his desk with a fresh cup of coffee. "How was your night?" he asked, looking up as she entered. Emma hesitated. How could she possibly explain what had happened? It was interesting, she said finally. I think I understand what those other campers were reporting. Mills nodded slowly. Did you see it? The question caught Emma off guard. See what? Whatever's been visiting that area for the past 2 months. We've had dozens of reports. Campers fleeing in the middle of the night. Hikers refusing to go back. Most people think it's just their imagination. But I know better. Emma stared at him. You've seen it too? Mills was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were dozens of incident reports, all describing encounters with something that defied explanation. Large humanoid figures, breathing sounds, the feeling of being watched. Started about 8 weeks ago, Mills said, right after we found that old mining camp back in the hills, been abandoned since the 1940s, but the Historical Society wanted to document it before the Forest Service closed the area off. What did they find? Records, mostly, equipment, and graves. Mills looked directly at her. 17 graves, Emma. Unmarked. But the coroner estimated they'd been there since the mine closed. Men who died in a collapse, according to the company records we found. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. And you think? I think something's been disturbed that should have been left alone. Something that's been trying to find its way home for 70 years. Mills closed the folder. The breathing sounds, the watching. It's not malevolent. It's just locked. Emma thought about the crying she had heard in the darkness, the profound sadness that had filled the forest clearing. What are you going to do about it? The Historical Society is working with the tribal council to give those men a proper burial. We're hoping that might put things to rest. Mills stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest. In the meantime, we're discouraging people from camping in that area. Emma nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. Ranger Mills, when you have the burial ceremony, would you let me know? I'd like to be there. Mills smiled for the first time since she'd met him. I think they'd like that. Something tells me you're the first person who's ever tried to understand, instead of just running away. Emma drove home through the morning sunshine, but her thoughts remained in the dark forest where something lonely had watched her through the night. She found herself hoping that Mills was right about the burial ceremony, that it would bring peace to whatever had been wandering those woods for so many years. But part of her also hoped that she would have the chance to return to the forest someday, to sit by another fire and listen to the breathing in the darkness, because now she understood that some things that seem terrifying are really just lost, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay still and listen to what they're trying to tell you. The forest had taught her that there are different kinds of fear, the fear that makes you run, and the fear that makes you stay, and sometimes, if you're very brave and very lucky, staying can transform both the thing you fear and yourself in ways you never imagined possible. 3 weeks later, Emma received a phone call from Ranger Mills. The burial ceremony had taken place at dawn that morning, and the tribal elder who conducted it reported that the forest felt different now, quieter, but in a peaceful way rather than an oppressive one. There had been no more reports of strange sounds or mysterious encounters in the northwest section of the forest. Emma thanked him for calling and hung up the phone. Then she looked out her apartment window at the distant mountains and smiled. Somewhere out there, 17 men were finally at rest, and the forest where you could hear breathing had become just a forest again. But she would never forget the sound of that breathing, or the night she learned that the most frightening encounters are sometimes the ones that teach us the most about compassion, courage, and the strange ways that the living and the dead can comfort each other across the vast loneliness of the dark.